It has been quite a first week in power for Boris Johnson. A cabinet bloodbath, promises of more spending and a by-election defeat. It certainly looked like the start of a general election campaign, but that's been ruled out by the Prime Minister and his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, before Brexit is delivered, come what may, on October the 31st. Mr Johnson is refusing to meet European leaders unless they're willing to countenance changing the Irish backstop, a game of hardball which caused the pound to sink again. So joining me now to try and make sense of the developments are Sonia Sodha of The Observer and Cindy Yu of The Spectator. Cindy Yu first. Last night's result surely shows that Boris Johnson has no guarantee of winning a general election. So do you think he would call one before October the 31st?
I think it would very much depend on the timing. So if it was called before October 31st and the Brexit Party has a very legitimate claim to say, actually, the Tories aren't really on your side with Brexit, so that would split the Conservative vote, as we saw last night in Brecon and Radnorshire as well. But if the general election was called after October 31st, and we did leave on October 31st, whether or not with a deal or not, Boris Johnson could have a pretty big majority, as a poll showed today in The Telegraph as well.
So, Sonia Sodha, I mean, deep trouble Labour's in, really, if you look at last night's result.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an extraordinary result. It's not a seat that you would expect Labour to do well in. It's a Conservative, Liberal Democrat marginal. But for the main opposition party to almost lose their deposit in Wales, which is really a Labour stronghold in general, is really quite extraordinary.
So the Boris Johnson bounce is real in your view?
I think there has been a bounce. I think all the polls show that. But I think the really tricky thing facing Boris Johnson this week is he may not be able to get Brexit through unless he does have a general election before the 31st of October. So after last night, his working parliamentary majority has gone down to 1. I mean, it really can't be any smaller than that. And we know that there are probably a couple of Conservative rebels, perhaps Philip Hammond, perhaps Dominic Grieve, who may well even take the very drastic step of voting against Boris Johnson in a no-confidence vote in order to stop a no-deal Brexit. So I think, it's very tricky territory for him.
Perilous, really.
Sorry?
It's perilous for Boris Johnson.
It is quite perilous, but at the same time, the Conservative Party is very united in terms of its tribalism.
United?
Sorry, not united, that's the wrong word. They're very tribal. The MPs are very tribal, so I think it would take a lot for long-serving MPs like Philip Hammond, Dominic Grieve, even though, despite their Remain positions, to no confidence the government and risk Jeremy Corbyn coming in, which to a lot of Conservatives right now is utterly inconceivable.
Well, in a way, last night did show that perhaps Boris Johnson can mobilise, if not unite, the Conservatives around Brexit. Should Remainers unite around Labour or the Lib Dems?
Well, I think it depends very much on what Jeremy Corbyn does over the next few weeks. So I think Labour's position, even though it's inched very gradually towards another referendum, it's still quite ambiguous. It's still not clearly a referendum and Remain party. So I think unless Jeremy Corbyn moves the party in that direction, he is going to lose votes to the Lib Dems. But I think if you're Boris Johnson and looking at last night's results, you'll be quite pleased that you've minimised the flow of voters to the Brexit party. So the Brexit party didn't, I think, do as well as it might have wanted to do. But the really big thing facing Boris Johnson is in those Lib Dem Tory marginals, of which there are quite a few, there are probably 30 to 50 in the country. It looks like the Lib Dems are going to do quite well in them. And it's very hard to see Boris Johnson's path to a majority if he loses, even in the region of 30 seats, the Liberal Democrats. That's a lot of seats he's got to win off the Labour Party.
I would just add on to that, though, that the Lib Dem victory last night is so credited to the Remain alliance. If they are to win all these swing seats as well, they would need a Remain alliance in all these other constituencies as well. And even if you are the Green Party or you're Plaid Cymru, would you really have an alliance in all of these constituencies, or would you eventually want something back for yourself as well?
I think that it's a big challenge of British politics. We're not used to seeing parties work together in this fashion. So I think it is more challenging in a general election than in a by-election, a one-off by-election. But I do think the Greens, parties like Plaid Cymru and the SNP, they will look at what happened last night and think, maybe we need to put the interests of the country and blocking no deal ahead of our partisan interests. But that is quite an extraordinary thing in British politics.
It's a pretty big leap.
I think it is going to be difficult.
Talking of working together, a lot of people are expecting some kind of pact with the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. What's your assessment of the likelihood of that?
I think it's unlikely. First of all, Boris Johnson, throughout his leadership campaign, has said we're going to put Nigel Farage back in his box, we're going to put the Brexit Party back in his box, Conservative Party is a party for leave. So that's his campaign pledge all the way through his leadership campaign. And then you look at who he's appointed around him. Dominic Cummings, who used to run Vote Leave. The competitor campaign for Leave to Leave.eu, which is the one that Nigel Farage ran. So there's a lot of bad blood there historically. So I think, looking at the team in number 10 at the moment, they're not really Nigel Farage's natural allies.
In a sentence, the first week, Boris Johnson has hit the ground running. Labour doesn't really seem to have worked out how to handle him, have they?
No, I don't think they have, and they're going to have to over the coming weeks. So that was one sentence.
That was very brief, Sonia Sodha. Cindy, thank you both very much for joining me.